Marcus stood in his apartment, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His sister's words echoed in his mind like a nightmare that wouldn't end. Sophie, his bright-eyed 4-year-old niece who always ran to hug him whenever he visited home, was lying in a hospital bed because the water she drank every day was slowly poisoning her. "Maria, is she going to be okay?" Marcus asked, his voice barely steady. "The doctors don't know yet," Maria replied, and he could hear her crying. "They're running tests, but, Marcus, it's not just Sophie. Half the children in the village are sick now. The hospital in Millbrook can't handle all of them, so they're sending some to the regional medical center." After ending the call, Marcus sat on his bed and stared at the wall for a long time. In 8 years of palace service, he had never faced a decision like this. He had always believed that doing his job well and staying out of politics was the right path. But his job had never involved his family's safety before. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the palace to find everything eerily quiet. Princess Elena's forced retreat had been spun by the palace communications team as a voluntary rest period, and life was returning to what Lord Blackwood and his allies considered normal. But Marcus could see the tension beneath the surface. Palace staff whispered in corners, security protocols had been quietly increased, and several journalists had been asking pointed questions about the princess's sudden absence. During his morning rounds, Marcus made a decision that went against every rule of palace security. Instead of following his assigned route, he made his way to the East Wing, where Princess Elena's offices were located. He needed to see something for himself. The princess's office suite was sealed off with official security tape, and 2 guards Marcus didn't recognize were posted outside. When he approached, claiming he needed to conduct a routine security sweep, one of the guards checked a list and shook his head. "Sorry, Chun. This area is off-limits to regular security personnel. Orders from the top." Marcus nodded and walked away, but not before noticing something significant. Through the window of Princess Elena's office, he could see that her desk had been cleared completely. All of her research materials, her personal items, even her computer had been removed. Someone had made sure that any evidence of her investigation had been eliminated. That afternoon, Marcus requested a brief meeting with Captain Rodriguez. He had spent hours thinking about how to approach this conversation without ending his career or putting himself in danger. "Captain, I wanted to discuss my family situation," Marcus began carefully. "My niece has been hospitalized, and I'm concerned about requesting emergency leave to visit her." Captain Rodriguez looked up from his paperwork. "I'm sorry to hear that, Marcus. What's wrong with your niece?" "She's been poisoned by contaminated water in Millbrook, along with several other children in the village." The captain's expression changed immediately. He set down his pen and studied Marcus's face carefully. "Poisoned by contaminated water?" "Yes, sir. The local doctor believes the contamination is related to mining operations in the area. The same mining operations that Princess Elena was investigating before her health leave." Captain Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he stood up and walked to his office door, closing it firmly and turning the lock. "Marcus, what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." Princess Elena didn't take a voluntary leave of absence. She was ordered to stop her investigation and to cease all public statements about the northern provinces. When she refused to comply, she was placed under what amounts to house arrest at the royal family's summer residence. Marcus felt a chill run through him. House arrest. It's being called protective custody, but the result is the same. She can't speak to the press, she can't access her research materials, and she can't continue her investigation. Captain Rodriguez sat back down heavily. "Marcus, there are people in this palace who care more about protecting powerful interests than protecting innocent civilians. Princess Elena discovered something that threatens a lot of very wealthy and influential people." "What did she discover?" "Evidence that the mining contamination isn't accidental. Internal company documents showing they knew the operations would poison the water supply, but they decided the profits were worth the risk. They calculated that paying medical costs and legal settlements would be cheaper than implementing proper safety measures." Marcus felt anger burning in his chest. They deliberately poisoned children for money? That's what the evidence suggests. And Princess Elena was planning to make that evidence public. Captain Rodriguez leaned forward. Marcus, I'm telling you this because your niece is one of those children. You have a right to know why she's suffering. But I'm also telling you because I need your help. My help. Princess Elena managed to get copies of some documents to Dr. Wellington before she was silenced. But Dr. Wellington is being pressured to bury her report. Lord Blackwood and his allies are using every tool at their disposal to keep this information from becoming public. Marcus understood immediately. What do you need me to do? I need you to make a choice, Marcus. You can continue following orders, keep your head down, and hope that someday justice will be served through proper channels. Or you can help me get the truth to people who can do something about it. What people? Captain Rodriguez opened his desk drawer and pulled out a business card. Janet Morrison. She's an investigative journalist with the National Herald. She's been trying to get information about the northern province's situation for weeks, but she's been blocked at every turn. Marcus stared at the card. Taking it would mean crossing a line he could never uncross. It would mean risking his career, his security clearance, and possibly his freedom. But he thought about Sophie lying in a hospital bed, and about all the other children whose only crime had been drinking water from their own wells. If I help you, what happens to Princess Elena? I don't know, Captain Rodriguez admitted. But I know that right now, she's the only member of the royal family who was willing to fight for those children. And if we don't do something, she's going to disappear from public life permanently, and the truth will disappear with her. Marcus took the business card. That evening, Marcus made a phone call that would change everything. Janet Morrison agreed to meet him at a small coffee shop in the city, far from the palace and its surveillance networks. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an intensity that reminded Marcus of Princess Elena. I want to be very clear about what you're offering, Morrison said after Marcus had explained the situation. You're talking about providing evidence of a cover-up that involves some of the most powerful people in the kingdom. Are you prepared for the consequences of that? My 4-year-old niece is in the hospital because these people decided her life was worth less than their profits, Marcus replied. Yes, I'm prepared for the consequences. Morrison nodded slowly. What kind of evidence are we talking about? Marcus handed her a folder that Captain Rodriguez had given him. Inside were photocopies of internal mining company documents, medical reports that had been suppressed, and a detailed analysis by Dr. Wellington that proved the contamination was both deliberate and ongoing. This is everything Princess Elena discovered, plus additional evidence that Dr. Wellington has been gathering, Marcus explained. The mining company knew that their operations would contaminate the water supply in at least 6 villages. They calculated that the medical costs and legal settlements would be approximately $12 million over 5 years. The additional safety measures needed to prevent contamination would have cost them $18 million. Morrison's eyes widened as she reviewed the documents. They chose to poison children because it was cheaper than doing the right thing. That's exactly what they did. And when Princess Elena tried to expose them, they silenced her and buried the evidence. What about the king? Does he know about this? According to Captain Rodriguez, Lord Blackwood has convinced the king that Princess Elena was acting emotionally and that the situation is being handled appropriately. The king believes that the princess needs rest and that the mining issues are minor problems that will be resolved through normal regulatory channels. Morrison spent nearly an hour reviewing every document in the folder. When she finally looked up, her expression was grim but determined. Marcus, this story is going to destroy some very powerful people, and they're going to fight back with everything they have. Are you absolutely certain you want to do this? Marcus thought about Sophie, about Maria's tears, about Princess Elena sitting alone in exile while children suffered. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. The story broke 3 days later on the front page of the National Herald. The headline read, Palace Cover-Up, Royal Guard Exposes Deliberate Poisoning of Village Children. The article included all of the evidence that Princess Elena had gathered, plus additional testimony from Dr. Wellington and several other medical professionals. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Within hours, protesters had gathered outside the palace gates demanding answers. The mining company's stock price collapsed. Several government officials resigned. And, most importantly, emergency medical teams were dispatched to all of the affected villages in the northern provinces. Marcus was arrested that same morning on charges of breaching palace security and unauthorized disclosure of classified information. As palace guards he had worked with for years placed him in handcuffs, he felt oddly calm. He had done what he needed to do. But the story didn't end with his arrest. The public outcry over the poisoned children was so intense that it could not be ignored or covered up. International health organizations demanded access to the affected areas. Foreign governments threatened to impose sanctions if the situation wasn't addressed immediately. Most importantly, King Edward himself traveled to Millbrook to see the situation firsthand. When he walked through the children's ward of the regional hospital and saw dozens of young patients suffering from preventable poisoning, something fundamental shifted in his understanding of the situation. That afternoon, the king made an unprecedented public statement. He announced the immediate suspension of all mining operations in the northern provinces, the establishment of an independent commission to investigate the contamination, and the dismissal of Lord Blackwood from his position as Lord Chancellor. Princess Elena was quietly released from her protective custody and resumed her duties. Her first official act was to visit the affected villages personally and to announce a comprehensive aid package for all families impacted by the contamination. Marcus spent 6 weeks in prison before the charges against him were dropped. The public pressure in his favor had become too intense to ignore, and several prominent legal organizations had taken up his case pro bono. When he was finally released, he discovered that his actions had made him something he had never intended to become, a hero. Princess Elena was waiting for him outside the prison gates. "Marcus," she said simply, "thank you. Your Highness, I just did what anyone would have done." "No," she replied firmly. "You did what very few people would have had the courage to do. You risked everything to protect children you had never met." Marcus was offered his job back with the palace guard, but he declined. Instead, he accepted a position as a safety inspector with the newly created Environmental Protection Division, a role that would allow him to help prevent situations like the Millbrook contamination from happening again. 6 months later, Marcus received a letter from his sister Maria. Sophie had made a full recovery, and the water in Millbrook was clean again. The mining company had been forced to implement extensive safety measures and to pay substantial compensation to all affected families. But, more importantly, Maria wrote, the children in Millbrook were playing again. They were laughing and running through the village streets, drinking clean water from wells that had been properly protected, and growing up in a community that had learned the value of speaking up when something is wrong. As Marcus read the letter, sitting in his new office overlooking the city, he realized that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply tell the truth, even when it's dangerous, even when it's difficult, and even when it means risking everything you've worked for. Because in the end, some things are more important than personal security. Some things are more important than following orders. And some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The guard who spoke up had found his voice, and in doing so, he had helped ensure that the voices of innocent children would never be silenced again. The consequences of Marcus's decision began to unfold faster than he had anticipated. 3 days after his conversation with Princess Elena in the library, he noticed a subtle but unmistakable shift in the palace atmosphere. Meetings that had previously been conducted in open conference rooms were now held behind closed doors. Lord Blackwood seemed to be everywhere at once, moving through the corridors with an urgency that Marcus had never observed before. During his morning briefing, Captain Rodriguez assigned Marcus to a new rotation that kept him away from the East Wing, where Princess Elena's offices were located. When Marcus asked about the change, the captain's explanation was casual but firm. "Just rotating assignments to keep things fresh, Chun. You'll be covering the north entrance and the state dining areas this week." Marcus knew better than to argue, but the timing felt deliberate. As he took up his new position near the north entrance, he found himself with a clear view of the palace's main courtyard where official vehicles arrived and departed throughout the day. It was from this vantage point that he witnessed something that made his blood run cold. Dr. Sarah Wellington, the kingdom's chief medical officer, arrived at the palace in an unmarked government car rather than her usual official vehicle. Marcus recognized her immediately. She was known for her integrity and her refusal to compromise on public health issues. What troubled him was the expression on her face as she hurried up the palace steps. She looked worried, almost frightened. 2 hours later, Dr. Wellington emerged from the palace looking even more distressed than when she had arrived. Marcus watched as she paused at the top of the steps, pulled out her phone, and made what appeared to be an urgent call. Even from a distance, he could see the tension in her body language. That afternoon brought an unexpected development. Princess Elena requested a security escort for an unscheduled visit to the Royal Archive building across the city. Marcus was surprised when Captain Rodriguez assigned him to the detail, given his recent reassignment. But orders were orders, and within an hour, he found himself in the passenger seat of a palace security vehicle while Princess Elena sat in the back, staring out the window with an expression he couldn't read. The Royal Archive was a massive stone building that housed centuries of official documents, government records, and historical materials. Princess Elena had never shown particular interest in historical research before, which made this visit all the more curious. As they walked through the archive's hushed corridors, Marcus noticed that she seemed to know exactly where she was going. Dr. Margaret Foster, the archive's chief librarian, greeted Princess Elena with obvious nervousness. She was a small woman in her 60s who had worked with government documents for most of her career. Marcus had met her several times during security briefings, and she had always struck him as calm and professional. Today, she seemed anxious and kept glancing around as if she expected someone to be watching. "Your Highness," Dr. Foster said quietly, "the documents you requested are in the secure reading room. As you requested, I've ensured complete privacy for your research." Marcus was positioned outside the reading room while Princess Elena spent nearly 3 hours reviewing whatever documents Dr. Foster had prepared. During that time, he noticed several interesting things. First, Dr. Foster made multiple trips to check on the princess, each time looking more worried than before. Second, 2 different government officials called the archive asking about Princess Elena's visit, both claiming they needed to know which documents she was reviewing for security purposes. When Princess Elena finally emerged from the reading room, her face was pale but determined. She thanked Dr. Foster quietly, then turned to Marcus. "We need to make one more stop before returning to the palace," she said. "I need to visit the Ministry of Health." The Ministry of Health was located in a modern glass building downtown, quite different from the ancient stones of the palace and the archive. As they drove through the city streets, Marcus couldn't help but notice that Princess Elena was gripping a leather document folder so tightly that her knuckles were white. At the ministry, Princess Elena requested a private meeting with Dr. Wellington. Marcus waited in the lobby while they spoke, but through the glass walls of Dr. Wellington's office, he could see the intensity of their conversation. Princess Elena was showing Dr. Wellington documents from the folder, pointing to specific sections and speaking with obvious urgency. The meeting lasted only 30 minutes, but when they emerged, both women looked grim. Dr. Wellington walked them to the elevator personally, something Marcus had never seen her do before. "Your Highness," Dr. Wellington said as they waited for the elevator, "I want you to understand the gravity of what you're proposing. The implications go far beyond the immediate health concerns." Princess Elena nodded. "I understand, Dr. Wellington, but we both know that some things are more important than political convenience." On the drive back to the palace, Princess Elena was silent for most of the journey. As they approached the palace gates, however, she suddenly spoke. "Marcus, I want you to know that I appreciate your honesty the other day. It takes courage to speak up when you see something wrong." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. These were dangerous words, the kind that could be interpreted as criticism of the current administration. Before he could respond, Princess Elena continued. "Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones who put us in danger. And sometimes the people who aren't supposed to have a voice are the only ones willing to tell the truth." That evening, Marcus was just finishing his shift when Captain Rodriguez called him into his office. The captain was a good man, someone Marcus respected, but tonight he looked uncomfortable. "Marcus, I need to ask you about your recent interactions with Princess Elena." Marcus felt his heart racing, but he kept his expression neutral. "What would you like to know, sir?" "There have been some concerns raised about conversations you may have had with the princess. Concerns about information sharing that might be outside the scope of your security duties." Sir, I've never shared any security information inappropriately. Captain Rodriguez studied his face carefully. I believe you, Marcus. But I need you to understand something. There are forces at work in this palace that are much larger than either of us. Princess Elena is going through a difficult time right now. She's been asking questions about policies and procedures that aren't really her area of responsibility. Marcus chose his words carefully. I've always conducted myself professionally in all my interactions with the royal family, sir. I know you have. That's why I'm talking to you directly instead of writing this up as a formal inquiry. The captain leaned forward. Marcus, I've been in palace security for 15 years. I've seen good people get caught up in political situations they didn't fully understand. I don't want that to happen to you. What are you suggesting, sir? I'm suggesting that you be very careful about any conversations you have with Princess Elena going forward. And if she asks you questions about your family or your background again, you should probably stick to very general answers. Marcus left the captain's office with his mind racing. It was clear that someone had been watching and listening more carefully than he had realized. The question was, who? And, more importantly, what did they plan to do about Princess Elena's investigation? The answer came the next morning in a way that Marcus never could have anticipated. He was conducting his usual security rounds when he noticed an unusual amount of activity near Lord Blackwood's offices. Several men in expensive suits were meeting in what appeared to be an emergency session. Marcus recognized most of them. They were the kingdom's most powerful business leaders and political advisors. Through a partially open door, Marcus caught fragments of their conversation. Situation must be contained before it escalates. The princess has access to information that could be very damaging. Economic stability of the entire mining sector. Perhaps it's time to consider reassigning her duties. Marcus felt his stomach drop. They were talking about Princess Elena as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a member of the royal family trying to protect her people. Later that morning, Marcus witnessed something that confirmed his worst fears. Lord Blackwood emerged from his offices with a document that he personally delivered to the king's private secretary. The document was in an official envelope marked urgent, confidential, and Lord Blackwood emphasized that it was to be placed directly in the king's hands. Marcus had been trained to notice details, and he couldn't help but observe the timing. Dr. Wellington's visit, Princess Elena's research trip, the emergency meeting with business leaders, and now an urgent confidential report to the king. It all fit together in a pattern that made him deeply uncomfortable. That afternoon brought the confirmation he had been dreading. During the palace staff briefing, an announcement was made that Princess Elena would be temporarily reducing her official duties due to health concerns. She would be taking a leave of absence from all government committees and would be focusing on rest and recovery. Marcus knew immediately that this was not about the princess's health. He had seen her just the day before, and she had appeared determined and energetic, not ill. This was about silencing someone who had become inconvenient. What happened next surprised everyone, including Marcus. Instead of quietly accepting her forced leave of absence, Princess Elena made an announcement of her own. She scheduled a press conference for the following morning, stating that she had important information to share about public health concerns in the northern provinces. The palace went into crisis mode almost immediately. Emergency meetings were called, press secretaries worked frantically to prepare statements, and security protocols were reviewed and updated. Marcus found himself reassigned once again, this time to external perimeter duty that would keep him far from any areas where the princess might be speaking to reporters. But Princess Elena had underestimated the lengths to which her opponents were willing to go. The morning of her scheduled press conference, Marcus arrived for his shift to find the palace buzzing with activity. Security personnel were everywhere, and several government officials Marcus didn't recognize were meeting with Lord Blackwood and other senior advisors. At 10 o'clock, exactly 1 hour before Princess Elena's press conference was scheduled to begin, an announcement was made that the event had been canceled due to a security threat. The princess, it was explained, was being moved to a secure location for her own protection while the threat was investigated. Marcus watched from his assigned post as Princess Elena's car left the palace under heavy security escort. Through the vehicle's tinted windows, he caught a glimpse of her face. She wasn't crying or looking defeated. Instead, she looked angry, angrier than he had ever seen anyone look. As the car disappeared through the palace gates, Marcus realized that this was far from over. Princess Elena had been silenced for now, but she had also been pushed past the point of quiet diplomacy. The question was no longer whether she would fight back, but how. That evening, Marcus received a phone call that changed everything. It was his sister Maria, calling from Millbrook with news that made his blood run cold. "Marcus," she said, her voice shaking with fear. "You need to know what's happening here. 3 more children were hospitalized today with the same stomach problems. And, Marcus, one of them is my little Sophie." Marcus Chun had been walking the marble corridors of Avalon Palace for 8 years, but he had never seen anything quite like this. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors as he made his rounds. His black uniform was pressed to perfection, his badge gleaming, and his radio crackling softly with routine security updates. At 32 years old, Marcus was considered one of the most reliable guards in the royal security detail. He knew every corner of the palace, every routine of the royal family, and every face that belonged within these walls. What he didn't expect was to witness something that would challenge everything he believed about loyalty, duty, and doing the right thing. The trouble began in the East Wing, where Princess Elena maintained her private offices. Marcus was conducting his usual morning security check when he heard raised voices coming from behind the heavy oak doors of the princess's meeting room. This wasn't entirely unusual. The royal family often had passionate discussions about state affairs, but something about the tone made him pause. Through the slightly open door, he could see Princess Elena sitting rigidly at the head of a long conference table. Her usually composed face was flushed with anger, and her hands were clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Across from her sat Lord Chancellor Reginald Blackwood, a man Marcus had always found unsettling despite his impeccable reputation. "Your Highness must understand the delicate nature of this situation," Lord Blackwood was saying, his voice smooth but carrying an undertone that made Marcus's instincts prickle. "The villages in the northern provinces are experiencing some difficulties, yes, but drawing attention to their problems would only cause unnecessary panic." Princess Elena's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Unnecessary panic? Lord Blackwood, we're talking about people who don't have clean water. Children who are getting sick because the mining operations you approved have contaminated their wells." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He had grown up in one of those northern villages before joining the palace guard. His own younger sister still lived there with her family. This conversation was about more than politics. It was about real people's lives. Lord Blackwood leaned back in his chair, his expression never changing from its practiced diplomatic mask. "Your Highness, I understand your compassion, but we must consider the broader economic implications. The mining operations provide jobs for thousands of workers and significant revenue for the crown. A temporary inconvenience for a few villages cannot override such important considerations." "Temporary inconvenience?" Princess Elena stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Lord Blackwood, I have reports here that show the contamination levels are 3 times what's considered safe." 3 times? And you call this a temporary inconvenience? Marcus knew he should continue his rounds, but something kept him frozen in place. In all his years of service, he had never heard Princess Elena speak with such passion about anything. Most of the royal family's discussions he had overheard were about ceremony schedules, trade negotiations, or diplomatic visits. This felt different. This felt real. "Your Highness," Lord Blackwood's voice took on a slightly sharper edge, though he maintained his diplomatic tone. "I must remind you that these matters fall under my jurisdiction as Lord Chancellor. The King has entrusted me with overseeing industrial development and economic policy. Your role is to focus on cultural affairs and charitable activities." The silence that followed was so thick Marcus could almost feel it pressing against the walls. When Princess Elena finally spoke, her voice was quiet but filled with a dangerous calm. "My role, Lord Blackwood, is to serve the people of this kingdom. All of the people, not just the ones who make the crown wealthy." Marcus heard footsteps approaching the door and quickly moved away, continuing his patrol route. But his mind was racing. He had always respected Princess Elena. She was known for her kindness and her genuine interest in the people, but He had never seen her stand up to one of the king's most powerful advisors before. As he walked through the palace corridors, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about what he had witnessed. He thought about his sister Maria and her two young children. He thought about the well behind their small house where they drew their water every day. He thought about the recent letter Maria had sent him, mentioning that several children in the village had been getting sick with stomach problems. The rest of his shift passed in a blur of routine activities, but Marcus's mind kept returning to that conversation. During his lunch break, he sat in the palace guard's common room, picking at his sandwich while the other guards chatted about sports and weekend plans. None of them seemed to know about the situation in the northern provinces. None of them seemed concerned about anything beyond their immediate duties. That afternoon, Marcus was assigned to escort Princess Elena to a charity function at the Children's Hospital in the capital city. As they rode in the royal car, he found himself studying her face in the rearview mirror. She looked tired, older than her 28 years, and there was a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. At the hospital, Marcus watched as Princess Elena visited with sick children, reading them stories and bringing smiles to their faces. She had a natural way with people, especially children, that seemed genuine rather than performed for the cameras. But even as she laughed and played with the young patients, Marcus could see the worry lines around her eyes. After the hospital visit, they returned to the palace just as the evening shift was beginning. Marcus was officially off duty, but he found himself walking past the East Wing again. The princess's office windows were still lit, and he could see her silhouette bent over her desk, working late into the evening. That night, Marcus lay in his small apartment in the palace staff quarters, staring at the ceiling and thinking about his conversation with Maria from the previous weekend. She had mentioned that old Mrs. Peterson, who lived 3 houses down, had been hospitalized with severe stomach problems. The local doctor suspected it might be related to the water, but no one wanted to make accusations without proof. Marcus had always prided himself on being a good soldier, a loyal guard who followed orders and kept his opinions to himself. His job was to protect the royal family, maintain palace security, and stay out of political matters. He had been trained to see everything, hear everything, and say nothing unless it directly related to security threats. But, lying in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of the city beyond the palace walls, Marcus realized that everything had changed. He had overheard something that could affect thousands of people, including his own family. He had seen a member of the royal family trying to do the right thing and being dismissed by someone who seemed more concerned with profit than people's lives. The question that kept him awake was simple but terrifying. What was he supposed to do with this information? Marcus had never considered himself a hero. He was just a regular guy from a small village who had worked hard to earn his place in the royal guard. He sent money home to help his family, followed orders without question, and took pride in doing his job well. He had never imagined himself in a situation where his loyalty to his position might conflict with his conscience. The next morning brought no clarity, only more questions. During the morning briefing, Captain Rodriguez went through the usual security updates and shift assignments. Nothing was mentioned about any problems in the northern provinces. Nothing was said about mining contamination or sick children. It was as if the conversation Marcus had overheard had never happened. But, as he began his rounds, Marcus noticed something different in Princess Elena's behavior. She seemed more determined, more focused, but also more isolated. During meetings with other palace officials, she asked pointed questions about public health initiatives and environmental protection measures. The responses she received were polite but dismissive, filled with bureaucratic language that said nothing while sounding important. Marcus began to realize that Princess Elena was fighting a battle she couldn't win alone. She had passion and good intentions, but she was surrounded by people who had their own agendas and their own definitions of what was best for the kingdom. That afternoon, while conducting a security sweep of the palace library, Marcus encountered Princess Elena again. She was sitting alone at one of the reading tables, surrounded by thick reports and official documents. Her usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled, as if she had been running her hands through it in frustration. "Good afternoon, Your Highness," Marcus said, maintaining the formal tone required by protocol. Princess Elena looked up, and, for a moment, Marcus saw something in her eyes that surprised him. It wasn't the confident composure he had always associated with royalty. It was exhaustion, frustration, and something that looked almost like desperation. "Good afternoon, Marcus," she replied, and he was surprised that she knew his name. "Tell me something. You're from the northern provinces, aren't you?" Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. This was dangerous territory. Personal questions from royalty about his background could lead anywhere. But something in her tone told him this wasn't idle curiosity. "Yes, Your Highness. I grew up in Millbrook." "Millbrook." She repeated the name slowly, as if she were memorizing it. "Do you still have family there?" "Yes, ma'am. My sister and her children." Princess Elena nodded and looked back down at the papers spread across the table. Marcus could see official letterheads, charts with numbers, and what looked like medical reports. After a long moment, she spoke again without looking up. "Have you heard from them recently? How are things in Millbrook?" This was the moment Marcus had been dreading since the previous morning. He could give a safe, generic answer and continue with his duties. He could pretend he hadn't overheard the conversation with Lord Blackwood. He could maintain his position, his security, his comfortable life within the palace walls. Or he could tell the truth. Marcus looked around the library to make sure they were alone, then took a step closer to the table. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "Your Highness, my sister mentioned in her last letter that several people in the village have been getting sick. Stomach problems, mostly affecting the children and elderly. The local doctor thinks it might be related to the water supply." Princess Elena's head snapped up, her eyes meeting his directly for the first time in their conversation. In that moment, Marcus saw something he had never expected to see in a member of the royal family: gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply. But the weight behind those two words told Marcus that he had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. As he left the library and continued his rounds, Marcus felt both terrified and strangely relieved. He had no idea what would happen next, but he knew that he had made a choice that he could live with. Whatever came next, he had chosen to speak up for people who had no voice in the marble halls of Avalon Palace. The afternoon sun continued to stream through the palace windows, casting the same long shadows across the polished floors. But for Marcus Chun, nothing would ever be quite the same again.